The massive John Deere rumbled forward, its steel teeth gleaming as Margaret Chen pressed her wheelchair against the garden gate. Nowhere to run. Behind the controls, Frank Holloway's face twisted with cruel satisfaction until he saw the figure emerging from the shadows. 25 years of silence was about to end, and the man who thought he owned this town was about to discover that some daughters never forget, and some debts can only be paid in full. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's Main Street as Margaret Chen wheeled herself toward the community garden, her weathered hands gripping the chair's worn rubber rims. At 68 she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate a world not built for her. Every push forward a small act of defiance against the accident that had claimed her legs 3 decades ago. The garden was her sanctuary. 12 raised beds. She'd fought the town council for 2 years to establish a place where tomatoes and peppers grew in neat rows, despite the skeptics who said nothing good could come from the old lot behind Miller's Hardware. She'd proven them wrong, just like she'd proven wrong everyone who said a woman in a wheelchair couldn't run the town's food bank, couldn't organize the annual harvest festival, couldn't be more than a burden to be pitied. Margaret was unlocking the garden gate when she heard the rumble. The sound made her stomach clench. Diesel engine, heavy machinery, the particular growl of Frank Holloway's tractor. She'd heard it too many times over the years, always preceding some new harassment, some fresh attempt to make her life smaller than it already was in his eyes. Frank Holloway owned half of Millbrook, including the auto parts store, 3 rental properties, and enough political influence to ensure the town council rarely opposed his wishes. He was 65, built like a linebacker, gone soft, with silver hair he combed straight back, and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. For 25 years, he'd made Margaret's life difficult in ways both large and small, parking his truck to block wheelchair-accessible spaces, spreading rumors about the food bank's finances, opposing every accessibility improvement to public buildings. But today felt different. Today, the sound was getting closer. Margaret turned her wheelchair as the massive green John Deere 6155R rounded the corner, its 40-foot cultivator attachments scraping against the asphalt. Frank sat high in the cab, his face set in grim determination. The machine was enormous, 16,000 pounds of steel and engine, designed to tear through earth and roots with mechanical indifference. He pulled the tractor to a stop just outside the garden fence, the engine idling with a menacing rumble. Margaret's hands tightened on her chair's armrests as Frank climbed down from the cab, his boots hitting the pavement with deliberate thuds. "Morning, Margaret," he said, his voice carrying false cheer. "Beautiful day for gardening, Frank." She kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "What brings you here with that machine?" "Well, funny thing about that." Frank walked closer, stopping just outside arm's reach. "I was down at the county courthouse yesterday, checking some property records. Turns out there's been a mistake about this lot." Margaret felt ice form in her chest. "What kind of mistake?" "The kind where the town thought they owned this land, when they gave you permission for your little garden project." Frank's smile widened. "Turns out, I bought this parcel from the county 3 years ago when they were selling off tax-delinquent properties. Been so busy with other projects, I clean forgot about it. Until yesterday. That's impossible. I have the permits." "Oh, I'm sure you do. But permits don't mean much when they're issued for land the town doesn't own." Frank gestured to the tractor behind him. "So I'm here to reclaim my property. Going to clear it out. Maybe put in a gravel lot for my parts store overflow." Margaret stared at him, then at the garden behind her. 2 years of work, dozens of families who depended on the fresh vegetables, the community that had grown around this space, neighbors working side by side, children learning where food came from. "You can't just destroy it," she said. "There has to be what?" Frank's false friendliness dropped away. "You going to fight me, Margaret? You going to stop me?" He gestured at her wheelchair, his meaning clear. "Some battles. You can't win from that chair?" The cruelty in his voice hit her like a physical blow. 25 years of small humiliations crystallized into this moment, Frank Holloway using her disability as a weapon, counting on her helplessness. "I want to see the deed," she said. "Don't need to show you anything. This is my land now." Frank turned toward the tractor. "I'm giving you 10 minutes to collect whatever personal items you might have in there. After that, I'm firing her up." Margaret watched him climb back into the cab, her mind racing. She pulled out her phone and dialed the police. But when Sergeant Phillips answered, his response was exactly what she'd feared. "If he's got legal ownership, Mrs. Chen, there's nothing we can do about it. You'd need to file an injunction, get a lawyer involved. That takes time." Time she didn't have. Frank was already engaging the tractor's power takeoff, the cultivator blades beginning to turn with a grinding mechanical shriek. Margaret ended the call and wheeled herself through the garden gate. Her hands shook as she gathered the hand tools from the storage shed, the watering can she'd brought from home, the small folding chair she used when working the lower beds. Each item felt heavier than it should, weighted with defeat. Behind her, the tractor's engine revved higher. Frank was positioning the machine at the garden's edge, the spinning blades just feet from her prized tomato plants. That's when she saw the car. A black Honda Civic pulled up across the street, and Margaret's breath caught. She recognized the vehicle, though she hadn't seen it in Millbrook for over 3 years. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out, tall, lean, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and eyes that missed nothing. Sarah Chen? Her daughter? Sarah surveyed the scene with the same methodical attention she'd learned in the army. The massive tractor, the spinning blades, her mother trapped between the machine and the garden fence. Her expression didn't change, but Margaret knew that look. It was the same face Sarah had worn at 18 when she'd confronted the boys who'd been tormenting her younger brother. Before she'd put Tommy Kellner in the hospital with 3 broken ribs, Frank hadn't noticed the new arrival. He was focused on his machine, savoring the moment before he destroyed 2 years of Margaret's work. The cultivator blades were spinning faster now, close enough to the fence that wood chips flew from the posts. Sarah crossed the street with smooth, predatory grace. She'd inherited her father's height and her mother's stubborn chin, but the way she moved was entirely her own, controlled, purposeful, dangerous. At 32, she was a veteran of 2 deployments, a military police officer who'd learned to handle men who thought women were easy targets. "Excuse me," Sarah called out, her voice carrying over the engine noise. Frank looked down from the tractor cab, and Margaret saw something flicker across his face, not quite recognition, but wariness. He'd known Sarah as a teenager, remembered her reputation for not backing down from fights. "You're trespassing," Frank shouted over the engine. "This is private property." "That's so." Sarah stepped closer to the tractor, close enough that Frank would have to run her down to move forward. "What's your name?" "Frank Holloway. I own this land, Mr. Holloway." Sarah's voice remained conversational, but Margaret could hear the steel underneath. "I'm going to need you to shut down your equipment." "Like hell I will. You got no authority here." Sarah reached into her back pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to display a badge. "Special Agent Sarah Chen, Maryland State Police Criminal Investigation Division, and I'm placing you under arrest for menacing with a dangerous weapon and assault with intent to cause bodily harm." Frank's face went pale. Yukontai wasn't operating heavy machinery in a threatening manner toward a disabled individual. "Constitutes assault in Maryland. Mr. Holloway, shut down your engine and step out of the vehicle. I want to see a warrant. Don't need one for a felony in progress." Sarah's hand moved to her service weapon. "Engine off now." The standoff stretched for long seconds, Frank's face cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally, calculation. He was remembering who Sarah was now, Margaret's daughter, the girl who'd left Millbrook to join the army, who'd come back harder and more dangerous than anyone expected. Slowly, reluctantly, Frank shut down the tractor. The sudden silence felt enormous. "Step down and put your hands where I can see them," Sarah ordered. Frank climbed down, his movements stiff with suppressed rage. "This is harassment. I'll have your job, you'll have the right to remain silent." Sarah cut him off, producing handcuffs. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As she cuffed Frank, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the weight of powerlessness lifting from her shoulders. Her daughter had come home, and Frank Holloway was finally learning that some people fought back. But as Sarah loaded him into the back of a police cruiser that had appeared as if summoned, Margaret saw the look in Frank's eyes. This wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. And she was right. Because what Frank didn't know, what nobody in 3 hours later, Sarah sat across from her mother at the kitchen table. The familiar yellow formica surface, scarred by decades of family meals and homework sessions. Margaret's hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold, her eyes fixed on the stack of documents Sarah had spread between them. "How long have you known?" Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah studied her mother's face, the premature lines around her eyes, the way her shoulders had begun to curve inward as if she were trying to make herself smaller. 6 weeks. The VA hospital in Baltimore called me when they were transferring your medical records. Standard procedure when a patient relocates care facilities. She tapped the top document with her finger. "Except you never relocated, did you, Mom? You never left Millbrook General." Margaret's silence stretched until it became an answer. "The lab work doesn't lie," Sarah continued, her voice gentle but relentless. "Chronic arsenic poisoning, levels that should have killed you 3 years ago. Someone's been feeding you poison, slowly, carefully, just enough to keep you sick, but not enough to be obvious." She leaned forward. "Who has access to your food, Mom? Who brings you groceries, comes to the house regularly?" "I can't," Margaret started, then stopped, her hands trembling around the mug. "You can't what?" "Can't tell me that Frank Holloway has been trying to murder you for God knows how long." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Margaret finally met her daughter's eyes, and Sarah saw a lifetime of fear there, carefully hidden behind stubborn pride. "You don't understand," Margaret said. "It's not just about me. It's about what happened before, what I know about him." Sarah felt ice form in her chest. "What do you know?" Margaret was quiet for so long that Sarah thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of 25 years of buried truth. "Your father didn't die in a car accident." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd been 7 when David Chen died, old enough to remember the funeral but young enough to accept the story she'd been told. Drunk driver, icy roads, tragic accident. The narrative had shaped her childhood, her decision to become a police officer, her need to prevent other families from experiencing what hers had endured. What are you saying? I'm saying Frank Holloway killed your father, and I'm the only person who knows the truth. Sarah's training kicked in, the investigative part of her mind cataloging questions even as the daughter in her reeled from the revelation. Tell me everything. From the beginning. Margaret closed her eyes, as if the act of remembering required shutting out the present. Your father was the town's building inspector then. Good man, honest man, too honest. She opened her eyes, meeting Sarah's gaze. Frank was developing that big shopping center project on Route 9, the one that never got built. Your father found problems, structural issues, code violations, bribes to get permits approved. Big problems. So Dad was going to shut it down. More than that, he'd documented everything, was preparing to turn it over to the state attorney general. Federal investigators were already sniffing around because of the environmental impact reports Frank had falsified. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued, as if speaking the truth after decades of silence was giving her power. The project was worth $12 million to Frank. Your father's report would have destroyed him, probably sent him to prison. Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. When was Dad supposed to submit his report? December 15th. He died on December 12th? Jesus, Mom, why didn't you go to the police? Margaret's laugh was bitter. With what? The report disappeared from your father's office the night he died. His files, his notes, everything. And who was I going to tell? Sheriff Morrison was Frank's brother-in-law. Half the town council was in Frank's pocket. She gestured to her wheelchair. And then I had my accident 6 months later, and I had bigger problems to worry about. Your accident. Sarah's voice was flat. The one that put you in the wheelchair. Brake failure on Route 9, right near where Frank's shopping center was supposed to be built. Margaret met her daughter's eyes. You starting to see the pattern? Sarah was seeing more than a pattern. She was seeing a systematic campaign of violence spanning decades. A man who killed when necessary and settled for slow torture when murder was too risky. The poisoning made perfect sense. Now Margaret was the only witness to Frank's crimes, but killing her outright would draw attention. Better to keep her sick, weak, discredited. A sick woman's accusations would carry less weight than a healthy one's. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because I knew what you'd do. Margaret reached across the table, covering Sarah's hand with her own. You'd come back here and get yourself killed trying to prove something that can't be proven. Frank's been untouchable. For 25 years, you think one day is going to change that. Sarah stood, pacing to the window that looked out over the backyard where she'd played as a child. The swing set was still there, rusty and overgrown, a monument to the normal childhood that had ended when her father died. Maybe not one day, she said finally, but I'm not the same person who left here 3 years ago. I've got resources now, connections, and Frank just made a big mistake. What kind of mistake? Sarah turned back to her mother, and Margaret saw something dangerous. In her daughter's smile, he threatened a police officer's mother with heavy machinery. That's not just local jurisdiction anymore. That's federal assault on a law enforcement family member. And unlike the local boys, the FBI doesn't care how much of the town Frank owns. Margaret felt a spark of hope, quickly followed by fear. Sarah, you don't know how deep this goes. Frank's got friends, people who owe him favors. I know exactly how deep it goes. Sarah pulled out her phone, scrolling through a list of contacts. While you were resting this afternoon, I made some calls. Turns out the FBI has been very interested in certain activities in rural Maryland counties. Money laundering, public corruption, suspicious deaths. She found the number she was looking for. Frank's not as untouchable as he thinks. Before Margaret could protest, Sarah had dialed. The call was answered on the second ring. Agent Morrison, this is Sarah Chen. Yeah, I know it's been a while. Listen, I need to talk to you about that thing we discussed in Baltimore, the pattern analysis. I think I found your missing piece. Margaret watched her daughter's face change as she spoke, becoming harder, more focused. This wasn't the girl who'd left Millbrook heartbroken and angry. This was a federal investigator who'd learned to hunt predators in human clothing. How soon can you get here? Sarah continued. Good, and bring everything you have on the Millbrook development projects, from 1998 to 2010. Yeah, all of it, because I think we just found the key witness you've been looking for. Sarah ended the call and turned back to her mother. Agent Morrison will be here tomorrow morning with a full forensic team. They're going to want to hear everything you remember about Dad's investigation, and they're going to want samples for the poisoning analysis. What if Frank finds out? Let him find out. Sarah's voice carried a cold certainty that made Margaret shiver. He's been playing chess with unarmed opponents for 25 years. Time he learned what it feels like to face someone who knows how to fight back. As if summoned by her words, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it, and her expression darkened. What is it? Margaret asked. Frank made bail 2 hours ago, and according to my contact at the courthouse, he just filed a formal complaint against me for false arrest and exceeding jurisdiction. Sarah looked up from her phone. He's not backing down. I told you no, Mom. This is good news. Sarah's smile was sharp as a blade, because it means he's scared enough to make mistakes. and scared men always reveal more than they mean. 2. Margaret was about to respond when they heard the sound of vehicles outside, multiple engines. Diesel heavy, getting closer. Sarah moved to the front window and peered through the curtains. "Well," she said quietly, "looks like Frank's decided to escalate things." 3 pickup trucks had pulled up outside the house, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Frank Holloway sat in the lead truck, flanked by 2 men Margaret recognized as his employees from the auto parts store. The other trucks carried more men, 6 in total, all staring at the house with the kind of focused attention that made her skin crawl. "They're not doing anything illegal," Sarah observed, "just sitting there, watching. It's intimidation." "Yeah, it is." Sarah pulled out her phone again, but intimidation works both ways. She speed dialed a number, never taking her eyes off the trucks outside. "Hey Martinez, it's Chun. I need a favor. How many state police units can you get to Millbrook in the next 20 minutes? "No, I'm not in immediate danger, but I've got 6 men with a history of violence conducting surveillance on a federal witness." "Yeah, that kind of witness." Margaret watched her daughter orchestrate the response with cold efficiency, and for the first time in 25 years, she felt something other than fear when facing Frank Holloway's intimidation. She felt hope. But she also felt the weight of years pressing down on her, the knowledge that Frank had resources and connections she couldn't imagine. As Sarah coordinated with law enforcement, Margaret wheeled herself to the back door and stepped onto the porch. Frank Holloway stood in his study at 3 a.m., staring at the wall of photographs that chronicled his rise to power in Millbrook. 25 years of groundbreakings, ribbon cuttings, and handshake deals with men who now occupied positions of influence throughout the state. His empire, built on the foundation of David Chen's silence. But David Chen's daughter was proving to be a problem he hadn't anticipated. The burner phone on his desk buzzed. Frank answered without checking the caller ID only 3 people had this number, and none of them called with good news. "We have a situation," said the voice on the other end. State Senator William Carver, Frank's oldest ally and biggest beneficiary. Morrison's team just served warrants on 6 different properties connected to the Millbrook development projects. They're pulling financial records going back to 1995. Frank felt ice form in his stomach. How is that possible? Those records were sealed apparently. Federal judges don't care about local confidentiality agreements when you're investigating organized crime. Carver's voice carried barely controlled panic. "Frank, they know. About the money, the permits, everything. And they've got someone talking who I think you know." "Who?" Frank closed his eyes, seeing Margaret Chen's face in his mind, defiant, even in her wheelchair. Protected now by a daughter who'd learned to use the system against men like him. He'd spent decades keeping Margaret weak, scared, isolated, but he'd made one crucial miscalculation. He'd never considered what would happen when her children grew up and learned to fight back. "What's our exposure?" Frank asked. "Total. The shopping center money laundering, the environmental report falsifications, the permit bribes, it's all connected. If they can prove the pattern, they can use RICO statutes." Carver paused. "Frank, they could seize everything. Every property, every business, every asset." Frank walked to his window, looking out over the town he'd controlled for a quarter century. Streetlights, illuminated empty roads, familiar buildings, the community garden where this had all started to unravel. His kingdom, built on carefully managed fear and selective violence. "What about our friends in law enforcement, running for cover? Sheriff Morrison already called to tell me he's cooperating fully with federal authorities." His exact words. Carver's bitter laugh carried over the phone. 30 years of campaign contributions, and he folds the moment the FBI shows up with badges. Frank wasn't surprised. Loyalty bought with money lasted only as long as the money outweighed the consequences, and federal prison sentences had a way of clarifying priorities. "We still have options," Frank said. "The Chen woman is old, sick. Her credibility doesn't matter anymore." Carver cut him off. "They've got forensic evidence now. Bank records, construction documents, toxicology reports showing chronic poisoning. They don't need her testimony to prove conspiracy. And murder? Murder." The word hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of decisions made in desperation 25 years ago. Frank had told himself at the time that killing David Chen was necessary, a business decision, one man's life against millions of dollars and dozens of careers. The math had seemed simple then. "What about the daughter?" Frank asked. "What about her? She's the one who started this. Remove her from the equation. Jesus Christ." "Frank, listen to yourself." Carver's voice was sharp with fear. "You want to kill a federal agent. You want to hand them a reason to bring in the full weight of the Justice Department, because that's what you're talking about." Frank knew Carver was right, but desperation was narrowing his options. 25 years of careful planning, of building an empire, one bribe and threat at a time, and it was all coming apart because he'd underestimated a woman in a wheelchair and her daughter's capacity for vengeance. "Then what do you suggest?" "Cut a deal, cooperate, give them what they want," and maybe Frank ended the call. Cooperation wasn't an option, not when it meant admitting to murder, conspiracy, and decades of corruption. Not when it meant losing everything he'd built, everything he'd killed to protect. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a .38 revolver, checking the cylinder out of habit. 6 rounds. Enough for what he was contemplating. But even as he held the weapon, Frank knew that violence wouldn't solve his problems this time. Sarah Chen wasn't an isolated building inspector with no connections and no protection. She was part of a system that would respond to her death with overwhelming force. Unless he could make it look like something else entirely. Frank picked up his regular phone and dialed a number he'd memorized, but never used his contact with the regional organized crime network that had made his success possible. Insurance, they'd called it. Protection against exactly this kind of situation. It's Holloway, he said when the call was answered. I need to activate the contingency plan. That's expensive insurance. Frank, you sure you want to pay that premium? Frank looked again at the photographs on his wall, his life's work, his legacy, everything he'd sacrificed to achieve. Name your price. 12 hours later, Sarah Chen sat in the FBI's mobile command center, parked discreetly behind Miller's Hardware. 3 monitors showed surveillance feeds from around Millbrook, tracking the movements of key suspects and witnesses. Agent Morrison stood behind her, coordinating with teams in Baltimore and Washington as the investigation expanded beyond anything Sarah had imagined possible. Frank's been busy, Morrison said, pointing to a screen showing bank transfer records. In the last 6 hours, he's moved $12 million through offshore accounts. Either he's planning to run, or he's paying for something expensive. Like what? Like professional help, the kind that specializes in making problems disappear permanently. Sarah felt cold understanding wash over her. He's putting a contract out. That would be my assessment. We've got protective details on you and your mother, but Frank's got resources we're still mapping. And desperate men make dangerous decisions. Sarah studied the financial records, seeing the pattern of payments that suggested Frank was activating networks built over decades. This wasn't just local corruption, anymore it was organized crime with national reach. The kind of operation that could make federal agents disappear without a trace. How long do we have? Unknown, but probably not long. Morrison pulled up another screen showing surveillance footage from various locations around town. Frank's meeting with people, lots of people. Some we recognize, some we don't. He's calling in every favor, activating every connection. Sarah watched the footage. Frank in conversation with men she didn't recognize. Handshakes and envelope exchanges that spoke of deals being made in shadow. Her intervention yesterday had triggered something much larger than she'd anticipated, and now she was trapped in the center of it. There's something else, Morrison continued. We intercepted communications suggesting Frank's not just targeting you. He's planning something for the entire investigation team. A mass casualty event designed to eliminate witnesses and evidence simultaneously. Like what? We're not sure yet. But given his resources and connections, probably something that would look like an accident or terrorist attack. Something that would shut down the investigation and give him time to disappear. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. By coming home to protect her mother, she'd endangered not just herself, but an entire federal investigation. Dozens of agents, years of work, all at risk because she'd made Frank desperate enough to activate his deepest connections.
What's up?
Next move, we accelerate everything. Instead of building the case methodically over months, we move now, before Frank can implement whatever he's planning. Morrison gestured to the screens around them. We've got enough evidence to arrest him and most of his network. It won't be perfect, but it'll be enough to prevent whatever massacre he's contemplating. Sarah nodded, but something nagged at her, a detail that didn't fit the pattern. Agent Morrison, if Frank's planning something that big, why isn't he running? Why stay in Millbrook, where we can monitor his movements? Morrison paused, considering the question. Maybe he can't run. Maybe he's too invested in what he's built here. Or maybe, Sarah said slowly, staying in Millbrook is part of his plan. Maybe whatever he's got planned requires him to be here, in a place where he controls the variables. Before Morrison could respond, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She opened it, and her blood ran cold. The message contained a single photograph. Her mother, sitting in her wheelchair in the community garden, unaware that she was being watched through a high-powered scope. The timestamp showed it had been taken 20 minutes ago. Below the image was a simple message. Noon, come alone, or she dies. Sarah showed the phone to Morrison, whose face went pale. That's impossible. Your mother is supposed to be in protective custody. Sarah was already moving toward the door. Not anymore. She's not. Sarah, wait. This is obviously a trap. Of course it's a trap, but it's also the only move Frank has left. Sarah turned back to Morrison, her face set with grim determination. He can't run, can't hide, can't buy his way out of this. So he's going to try to end it the only way he knows, how, with violence and intimidation. So we call in tactical teams, surround the area, and he kills my mother the moment he sees federal agents. Sarah shook her head. No, again. 2 weeks after Frank Holloway's arrest, Sarah Chen stood in the ruins of what had once been Millbrook's City Hall. The explosion had come at 3:47 a.m., professional and precise. destroying decades of municipal records and leaving a crater where the building's foundation had been. No one was hurt. The timing had been carefully chosen to minimize casualties while maximizing the message. We can reach you anywhere. We can destroy anything you care about, and we're just getting started. Thermite charges, Agent Morrison said, picking her way through the rubble. Military grade, placed by someone who knew exactly which structural points to hit for maximum destruction. This wasn't revenge. It was surgery. Sarah nodded, her trained eye cataloging the destruction. 3 days after the City Hall bombing, the county courthouse had suffered a similar fate. Yesterday, it had been the regional FBI field office in Cumberland, each attack more brazen than the last, each one a demonstration that Frank's arrest had only provoked a more dangerous enemy. Any word from the safe house? Sarah asked. Your mother's secure. The facility in Virginia is off-grid, military protected. They'd need an army to get to her there. Morrison paused, studying Sarah's face. But you already know that's not what this is about, don't you? Sarah did know. The attacks weren't designed to eliminate witnesses, they were designed to break her, to show her that no matter how many federal agents surrounded her, no matter how many safe houses she used, the people she cared about would never be truly safe. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from an unknown sender. Sarah opened it, and her blood turned to ice. The message contained a single photograph. The community garden, completely destroyed. Every raised bed torn apart, every plant uprooted. The soil salted so nothing would ever grow there again. But it wasn't the destruction that made Sarah's hands shake. It was what had been left in the center of the devastation. A single wooden cross, painted white, with a name burned into it, David Chen. Below the photograph was a message. Your father's grave wasn't the only thing we can dig up. Sarah showed the phone to Morrison, whose face went pale. Jesus Christ. They exhumed your father's body. No, Sarah said quietly, understanding flooding through her with horrifying clarity. They never buried him in the first place. The implications hit both women simultaneously. 25 years ago, the body that had been buried in Millbrook Cemetery hadn't been David Chen. It had been someone else, a homeless man, an unidentified victim, someone whose disappearance would never be investigated. David Chen's actual remains had been kept as insurance, leverage for exactly this kind of situation. They're telling us they can prove Frank didn't kill your father, Morrison said. They can produce forensic evidence showing he died somewhere else, at someone else's hands. Everything your mother testified to becomes worthless. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. Frank's conviction would be overturned. The entire federal investigation would collapse. And whoever was really behind David Chen's death, the people Frank had been protecting all these years, would disappear into the shadows while Frank took the fall for crimes he hadn't committed. Unless, Sarah said slowly, we find David's real remains first. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown sender. Midnight. Holloway Quarry. Come alone, and maybe you'll finally learn what happened to Daddy. Morrison grabbed Sarah's arm. Don't even think about it. This is exactly what they want, to draw you into a kill zone where they can eliminate the last threat to their operation. Maybe, or maybe it's our only chance to get ahead of this thing before they destroy everything we've built. Sarah pulled up a map on her phone, studying the location. Holloway Quarry, that's where Frank's construction company dumped excess materials for 30 years. If they wanted to hide a body permanently, it's a trap, Sarah. Everything's been a trap since the day I came home, but traps work both ways. Sarah looked at Morrison with grim determination. How many assets can you get to the quarry without being detected? Sarah, how many? Morrison sighed, recognizing the futility of arguing with someone who'd inherited her mother's stubborn streak. If we do this, we do it right. Full tactical support, surveillance teams, extraction protocols. No heroic nonsense. Agreed. But if this goes wrong, if they grab me, they won't. If they do, Sarah continued, you protect my mother. Whatever it costs. Whoever you have to deal with, you keep her safe. Morrison nodded, but Sarah could see the doubt in her eyes. They both knew they were walking into something much larger than they understood, facing an enemy with resources and connections that spanned decades. 6 hours later, Sarah approached Holloway Quarry alone, her service weapon holstered but ready, communication devices hidden throughout her clothing. The quarry was a massive excavation site, carved into the hillside like a wound in the earth. Floodlights illuminated the bottom of the pit, where industrial equipment sat silent and menacing. In the artificial daylight, as Sarah descended the access road, she could see movement in the shadows, figures positioned around the quarry's rim, professional and patient, at least a dozen, possibly more. Whatever organization had taken over Frank's network, they'd committed serious resources to this confrontation. At the bottom of the quarry, a single figure waited beside a piece of heavy excavation equipment. As Sarah got closer, she could see it was a woman in her 60s. Impeccably dressed, despite the industrial setting, with silver hair and the kind of authoritative bearing that suggested a lifetime of giving orders and having them obeyed. Agent Chen, the woman said, as Sarah approached. Thank you for coming. My name is Victoria Carver. I believe you've been in contact with my son, Senator William Carver. Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. The political connections, the protection Frank had enjoyed for decades, the resources being deployed against the federal investigation. You're the one who's been pulling the strings. I prefer to think of myself as someone who understands how systems actually work. Victoria gestured to the excavator beside her. Your father was an idealistic man, Agent Chen. He thought truth and justice mattered more than practical considerations. It's a charming worldview, but ultimately naive. Where is he? Victoria smiled, the expression carrying no warmth. Closer than you might think. Your father's remains have been preserved in a climate-controlled environment for 25 years, waiting for exactly this moment. Forensic analysis will show he died of natural causes, a heart attack brought on by stress. No murder, no conspiracy. Just a good man who worked himself to death trying to fight corruption he couldn't understand. And you expect me to believe that? I expect you to understand the practical implications. With no murder to investigate, Frank Holloway becomes nothing more than a small-time grifter who took bribes and falsified reports. The federal conspiracy charges disappear. The RICO prosecutions collapse. Everyone goes home, and life returns to normal. Sarah studied Victoria's face, seeing the confidence of someone who'd spent decades manipulating systems and people to her advantage. What's the alternative? The alternative is that your father's remains disappear forever, and your mother spends the rest of her life in federal protection, watching over her shoulder for threats that will never stop coming. Victoria's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. You've hurt us, Agent Chen, but you haven't destroyed us. We have resources you can't imagine, patience you can't match, and connections that reach into the highest levels of government. So this is about revenge. This is about preservation. We've built something important over the past 30 years, a network that ensures certain necessary activities continue without interference from idealistic reformers. Your investigation threatens that network, so the network is responding. Sarah felt the weight of surveillance around her, the sense of being surrounded by professionals who could end her life at a word from Victoria Carver. But she also felt something else, the stubborn refusal to surrender that she'd inherited from both her parents. You made one mistake, Sarah said. What's that? You assumed my mother was just a victim. Sarah smiled, seeing confusion flicker across Victoria's face. You assumed she spent 25 years being scared and helpless, instead of planning and preparing. Agent Chen, your mother is a disabled woman with no resources and no connections. My mother is a woman who spent 25 years building a network of her own. Every person Frank threatened, every family he hurt, every worker he cheated, she kept track of all of them. And when Frank started poisoning her, she started gathering evidence. Sarah pulled out her phone, showing Victoria a recording application that had been running since she'd entered the quarry. Everything you've said in the last 10 minutes is being transmitted in real time to FBI servers and simultaneously to news organizations across the country. Your confession, your threats, your admission that you've been preserving my father's remains as leverage. Victoria's composed mask slipped for the first time, revealing something cold and dangerous underneath. You think a recording matters? You think media attention will protect you? I think you're about to find out. Sarah gestured to the quarry's rim where new lights were appearing, vehicle headlights. Dozens of them, converging on the site from multiple directions. Agent Morrison wasn't just